Hello and a very warm welcome to Bharata First. You're watching Big Picture with Pereira. With the objective of giving a proper interpretation of a Supreme Court ruling, the government on Monday introduced a bill in the Lok Sabha that seeks to define certain roles and powers of the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi. Union Minister of State for Home G. Kishan Reddy introduced the Government of National Capital Territory of Delhi Amendment Bill 2021. The bill makes it mandatory for the Delhi government to take the opinion of the LG before any executive action in the city. It also bars the Delhi government from making any rule to enable itself or its committees to consider the matters of day-to-day administration of the capital or conduct inquiries in relation to the administrative decisions. Any rule made till this act comes into effect will be void according to the bill. In this edition of Big Picture, we will analyze the Government of National Capital Territory of Delhi Amendment Bill 2021 and the tussle between the centre and state in Delhi. Joining me on the program today are P.K. Malhotra, former Law Secretary, Government of India, Sanjay Hegde, Senior Advocate to the Supreme Court, and Chakshu Roy, Head Outreach, PRS Legislative Research. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Big Picture. All right, Mr. Malhotra, let me start the program with you first. Let's understand, what is it that is going to change with this bill? What are the salient features of the bill?
You see, basically, when the Supreme Court, Constitution Bench of the Supreme Court delivered its judgment in 2018, defining what is the role of the Lieutenant Governor in the working of the Delhi government and what are the powers of the Council of Minister of Delhi, probably that has created a little kind of uneasiness in the central government. And probably it is to overcome the decision given by the Supreme Court in that particular judgment that this amendment has been brought. What happened? The Supreme Court, when it decided, a Constitution Bench decided, it decided certain power of the Lieutenant Governor as well as the Delhi government. So far as the status of Delhi is concerned, the Supreme Court clarified that Delhi is a union territory and it is not a state. And it is because of its peculiar status, there are certain powers which have been conferred on the Legislative Assembly, but it is not equivalent to the Legislative Assembly of a state because it is still a union territory. So with certain restricted right, and those restricted rights are only with regard to land, public order, and the police force. Barring these three elements, rest of the power of the state government, which are available under list 2 of Schedule 7 of the Constitution, the Parliament is competent to make a law. But in case there is a difference of opinion with regard to the functioning of the government and on executive matters, if there is a difference of opinion between the state government as well as the Lieutenant Governor, the matter can go to the President and whose decision will be final. Because it goes without saying, it being a union territory, the Lieutenant Governor is representative of the government and the union territories in general are controlled by the central government. So what the Supreme Court has said is that Delhi is not a state and therefore all the powers of the state government are not available to Delhi. It is governed by Article 239 AA, read with the National Capital Territory of Delhi Act 1992, where how it will be functioning, that is defined. Then any matter does not matter because it says any matter, and the Supreme Court interpreted any matter. It does not imply that each and every matter should go to the Lieutenant Governor. It is only in exceptional cases it goes to the Lieutenant Governor, and it should not be matter. It should not go as a matter of routine. That is the other point on which it's said. And then the Lieutenant Governor is supposed to act on the aid and advice of the Council of Minister. It is not that every matter approval of the Lieutenant Governor is required. Probably that became a cause of concern for the central government. And probably this situation has arisen for the simple reason because we have to appreciate and understand that, as I said initially, Delhi is in a peculiar state, it being the national capital territory. The seat of the central government is also here. And so that there is no conflict of interest, certain powers are still reserved by the central government in spite of the fact that the Legislative Assembly has been given to this union territory. So in that case, when the position was clarified by the Supreme Court, the central government thought probably there is a possibility that there may be a conflict of interest and therefore position need to be clarified. And to overcome those difficulties, this bill has been introduced in the parliament, restricting the power of the legislative assembly and giving more power to the lieutenant governor as a representative of the president. That is in nutshell the impact of this bill, and that is why the state government feels that probably the federal structure of the constitution has been destroyed by introduction of this bill. That is the apprehension of the state government, but central government says that it is only clarificatory in nature with regard to the power to be exercised by the legislative assembly of Delhi and the power to be exercised by the lieutenant governor of Delhi.
Right. Okay. Since we are here, then, Sanjay Hegde, let me bring you in. So, are the apprehensions of the state government justified? What is it that they are worried and concerned about?
See, as Mr. Malhotra said, the Supreme Court had clarified that the governance of the National Capital Territory of Delhi is not a full state. However, it was slightly more than a union territory, though the Supreme Court did not explicitly say so. It restricted the governor, the lieutenant governor's role to 3 defined areas. As far as the rest is concerned, it left a great play in the joints. Now, even that position in law is obviously not acceptable to the central government. We are a system of governance which has been described as quasi-federal. We are not like the United States, where independent states came together and then formed a union. And most of the rights continue with the states. Our system of governance owes a lot to the British Government of India Act of 1935, which then, with a lot of changes and additions, largely formed the basis of our constitutional scheme. While the parliament has the power to make and unmake states, in recent times, parliament has now started getting states down to the form of union territories. It has started reducing them. It did it in Jammu and Kashmir, and now this is the other kind of anomaly which parliament now seems to be taking over. This runs contrary to the large scheme towards finding greater representation for Delhi, which started from 1991 onwards. It was in those days that it was a BJP demand that there should be full statehood for Delhi. Everybody recognizes that, you see, with the national capital also being there, you cannot have full statehood. But then over most portions of Delhi, it is just like any other part of India. Why should the fact that there is a national capital impact the citizens of Nangloi, of Alipur, and so many areas? And you must also note that Delhi has nearly 2 crore people. 2 crores is about half the size of the state of Gujarat. It is much bigger than many of the states, including the state of Goa. So you have 2 crore people without an equivalent form of government which they would have been entitled to had they been inhabitants of any other state. So there was a halfway house which was built under the 239A amendment, as well as the act which brought the National Capital Territory of Delhi into being. Now that is being, what shall I say, slowly effaced. You have a form of governance. You also have the municipal corporations in 4 parts of Delhi. So this is slightly more than a municipal corporation, definitely not a state. And now, to a great extent, it is like any other union territory with the chief administrator and the lieutenant governor having an ultimate controlling say in everything. Is that a healthy development? Is that how we want our constitutional federalism to proceed? These are questions which will come to haunt the polity for a long time. But at the end of the day, it's a question of power also. There is no doubt that this will pass Parliament.
Hmm.
Scrutiny by the courts also is very limited. Let us see what happens.
Okay, scrutiny of the courts, that particular aspect I'll come to in just a bit. I'll take that up with you, Mr. Malhotra. But before that, Chakshu, let me come across to you. Since Sanjay Hegde brought up the issue of how this particular bill is likely to sail through Parliament, your thoughts on that and your thoughts on really some of the key features of the bill itself.
Frank, I think after Mr. Hegde and Mr. Malhotra have talked extensively about the bill, I think what I can add is a little bit of a historical context. And, picking up from where Mr. Hegde left off, if you look at, the organization of states in the country, when the constitution started, we had states with different categories. There were states which were full states with a legislature which had all the powers of a state, and there were other states where the legislatures had lesser powers. Then we graduated onto a system after the States Reorganization Act where we had states and then we had union territories, which were loosely to say federally administered territories. And then over the years, the attempt was to graduate the union territories to states. So you would notice that, some of the states in the Northeast started out as union territories and then they attained full statehood. Delhi had a mixed start off. It started off with a legislative assembly in the early 50s. Then the legislative assembly was disbanded. And then a legislative assembly was brought back in 1991. Now, what does it mean for a quasi-state, semi-union territory to have a legislative assembly is the question that we are discussing. While I might not want to draw parallels, but let's say Puducherry also has a legislature. Now that legislature and the government has very limited powers. For most things, they have to look at the lieutenant governor or they have to look at the home ministry, even for financial sanctions above, I think 25 or 30 crore rupees. Now, in the context of Delhi, there is obviously a larger question as to what should be Delhi's political representative structure. Should it have a legislature? Should it not have a legislature? How should it be administered? Because it is a federal, it is the capital of the country. Keeping that step aside, I think to me, there are two or three larger questions. One, obviously, is the larger question as to what should be the status of Delhi? What should be the way of political representation for the people of Delhi? That's one. The second is, how should we think about the federal and state relationship in our country? Mr. Hegde started off by saying and differentiating about how the United States and the states, got together there and how it was done for India. And that tenuous relationship between, a federation and its states is again something that is at question. To your question about as to whether the bill will, pass through in Parliament or sail through in Parliament, the numerical numbers seem to be there with the government in both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. But what I would really ideally like to see is that bill be referred to a parliamentary committee. I think in the normal course of our legislative process, every piece of legislation, no matter how small or how big or how contentious, political, otherwise, should definitely go to a parliamentary committee. So I hope that when it comes up for discussion, some members will demand that the bill be referred to a parliamentary.
Absolutely. All right. Since we are here then, Mr. Malhotra, let's talk about the aspect that Mr. Hegde raised earlier in the program, about the limited scope, for scrutiny of the courts. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what Mr. Hegde meant was probably it is a power of judicial review by the parliament of the legislation which is passed by the parliament. In fact, the earlier also when the PAL was filed and the decision was given in the case of PUCL, and in the judgment in the case of the petition filed by the government of National Capital Territory of Delhi, the Supreme Court has clarified the power of the Legislative Assembly as well as the Lieutenant Governor. Now, if this bill is passed, and Mr. Chakshu was, I think, very optimistic, if we look at the immediate past practice which has been going on for the last 3-4 years, probably very few bills have been referred to the parliamentary standing committees and bills have been discussed in the House itself. I wish probably that practice is followed and the standing committee get an opportunity to discuss the bill and something more comes out and more effective deliberation among the members of the parliament, keeping in view the comments which will be coming from the outside organization is also taken into consideration. But when if the legislative competence is there and if the legislative competence is there and the law is not violating any of the fundamental rights and the procedure has been followed, probably the Supreme Court will not interfere with the law passed by the parliament. No fundamental right is violated, procedure has been followed, and the competency is there. And so far as the competency is concerned, let me draw your attention to clause 7 of Article 239AA, which specifically empowers the parliament that it may by law make provision for giving effect to any of the provision of this part of the constitution. So exercising that power, probably what the central government is doing right now is doing away with the effect which has been created or the impact which has been created by the judgment given by the Constitution bench of the Supreme Court. I think that is one area where I don't know, how the Supreme Court will react to it. It will all depend on the kind of arguments which are placed before the court. And we have yet to see it because matter is still before the legislature. And obviously, as Mr. Hegde also said, keeping with the number which the government is having, there is every possibility that the law will be passed by the parliament. Once it is passed, then whether it is challenged in the court or not, and if it is challenged, then the three principles which I have stated, on those basis, it will be examined by the court, and let us see how the court gives its verdict on that.
Absolutely. All right. So, Sanjay Hegde, let me bring in another aspect. A point that Chakshu raised in his opening remark. What should the status of Delhi be? There is no doubt that Delhi is indeed special. Because of where it is, because it's the national capital as well. So, should we have a legislative assembly at all? And if we need to have true good governance, what is the best form of system that we need to have in Delhi?
That's a larger political and philosophical issue. Ultimately, you had a revolution in the US on the principle of no taxation without representation. Here you have 2 crore people, which is, I compared it to the population of several Indian states, but it is 20 million people, which is bigger than many a country in the United Nations. So should they not be able to elect their representatives who can effectively legislate given the local conditions? Just because the national capital is also there, should they be denied it? You see, in the United States, there is currently a move to make even the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., into a state. Of course, it's for different reasons. They want to have separate senators for Washington, D.C., therefore get over the gridlock in the Senate. But ultimately, you still come down to this basic question. Are we, in some form of or the other, a union of states? Or are we a central government which has component units which it can make and break at will? You must remember that especially the states reorganization in 1956, it did take into account a certain amount of linguistic and geographical concerns. Now, the people of Delhi have for a long time been without any elected chief minister. Delhi was a very small city to begin with when it was only a capital city. But as a result of centralized planning and everything ending up in Delhi, you now have a whole mass of your country living within Delhi. Can you deny them an assembly of their own, or an effective assembly of their own, or a chief minister who can actually do work? You can of course have a chief minister who will say, now what can I do? Everything is in the lieutenant governor's hands, but please elect me nevertheless. Is that democracy? So these issues are going to come up in times to come. I believe that this bill will pass tomorrow because on the government side, whips have been issued to all their members to be present and voting. So it does indicate a certain intent to pass it in the Lok Sabha tomorrow. And then the Rajya Sabha is just a matter of further time. So this reference to a parliamentary committee is a good idea. We have seen with the farm bills and other bills as to why a lack of discussion and quiet thought into the framing of legislation is so necessary. You can iron out a lot of wrinkles there. People can make suggestions. Otherwise, in Parliament, you seem to have speeches for the sake of stating positions, followed by voting strictly on party lines, bound by party whips on the pain of disqualification.
Sure.
Even if Parliament has to be more effective, I think that a lot of work needs to be done in the committees, and sending it to the committee would be a good idea, but I don't think it will happen.
All right. And since we are here, Chakshu, very quickly on what happens if a bill is sent to a committee, that is one. Secondly, what will change if this bill is passed by Parliament?
So, Frank, unlike Mr. Hegde and Mr. Malhotra, they are more practical and pragmatic. I think I'm letting my 40 years of exuberance still hope that something will happen. But no, I completely defer to them that if data is to suggest as to what the fate of this bill is going to be, probably, as and when it comes up in either house, it might, pass on the floor of the house itself. But in the faint chance that it does go to a parliamentary committee to be examined by it, then the committee will have an opportunity to listen to experts like Mr. Malhotra and Mr. Hegde. It will have the opportunity to listen to common citizens like you and me who would want to depose before the committee and express as to what is it that we feel about Delhi's political representation. And more importantly, it will also have the opportunity to discuss it behind closed doors without political rhetoric. So the technical aspects of it, the judicial aspect of it, the legal aspects of it can be discussed without people having to worry about being called out for their positioning, technical positioning on bill. Having said that, I think this piece of legislation will also probably be a test case about what happens in other cases, right? So, for example, the next time around we are talking about, we have an additional union territory. The next time we are talking about that union territory, what are the issues that we need to think about? What are the issues that we need to focus on? Mr. Hegde and Mr. Malhotra both are, roughly raising a point about what is the power of the center when it comes to making or breaking units, within the country. So those are things that are both in the political realm and also in the legal / judicial realm that need to be thought of. Mm-hmm. But I think, a word of caution here, whenever we do quick legislation, whenever we do legislation without adequate thought, it usually comes back, with some kind of a problem. And, an arbitration and conciliation bill was passed in 2015, and it has taken, two more or three more amendments to now, get some semblance of, sorting out the practical difficulties for it. So I hope that, our members of parliament will urge upon, the minister piloting the bill and, request him to see as to whether, some more time can be spent on discussing the bill outside of the, glare of TV cameras.
Sure. All right. Time now to get closing comments from all my guests with the best way forward. Starting first with you, Mr. Malhotra.
I think Chakshu has raised a very valid point with regard to consultation process and bills not being passed in haste. Therefore, the parliamentary practice of referring the bill to standing committees, which examine it, which is a prevalent for more than 2 decades, now need to be followed in this case also, so that there is a regular thought process goes into it before it is passed by the parliament. And I would like to highlight one more issue here, that in 2014, the government decided to go for a pre-legislative consultation process even before the bill is introduced in the parliament. Unfortunately, this practice is also followed more in breach. And I think time has come, if you really want to avoid the kind of agitations which we are seeing in the country today, the pre-legislative consultation process should also be followed, and the practice of referring the bills to the parliamentary standing committee should also be followed, so that there is a good process of consultation before a bills get a formal note from the parliament.
Right, Sanjay Hegde.
Well, ultimately, Delhi is too big to be governed by just decisions taken on individual impulses based on the circumstances at a particular moment. We do need a capital, we do need a federal government which is in charge of the capital, but equally, you cannot leave a large mass of your citizenry without representative government. It is about effective representative government, not about merely having decorative government.
All right, and Chakshu Roy, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Frank, this is a one-page bill which has wide ramifications. It has issues around urban governance. It has issues around political representation. It is around about how do we manage big cities in a country. Delhi will not be the only one. It might have a special circumstance, but does that special circumstance mean that legislation should fly through Parliament, or does it require for a little bit of a pause to think through some of the decisions that we are going to take in Parliament?
All right, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that the bill will most likely sail through Parliament. It will also have limited scope for scrutiny in the courts. The tussle between the centre and the state raises a bigger issue of how bills are passed, though. It would be best if contentious bills like this go through the scrutiny of parliamentary committees so that all issues are thrashed out. We need to work towards ensuring that all people are well represented. With that, it's a wrap. This is frankrausanpereira signing off. But before I leave, let me remind you to like and subscribe to Bharata First on YouTube and follow Bharata First on social media, and please spread the word.